Good afternoon. Welcome to 25 Minutes with Cap, where each month we discuss recent trends in the specialty insurance space with different leaders in the industry. My name's Adam Sills, and I'm thrilled to be joined this month by Karen Clark, CEO and co-founder of Karen Clark & Company. Ms. Clark created the first catastrophe model and founded the first cat modeling company in 1987, and has been recognized for her leadership and contributions in the field, including getting a Nobel Peace Prize certificate in 2007, which we'll be sure to ask about in the next 25 minutes. Karen, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Adam.
As we go on from here, if you have questions through the session, feel free to enter them into the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. And just a reminder that the content of this webinar is the property of CapSpecialty and is for informational purposes only. You're not permitted to republish, share, or quote from this webinar without the prior written consent of CapSpecialty, which can be obtained by contacting marketing@capspecialty.com. So first, Karen, how'd you get into the business?
Well, really, it was serendipity. I can't claim that there was any kind of advanced career planning. My first job after graduate school just happened to be with an insurance company, but it was a really cool position as a research associate in this small R&D department that the insurer had at the time. And my first assignment was to help the company figure out if they had too much coastal exposure, if they were too exposed to hurricanes, and how do they know when they're writing too much. So that's when I started researching hurricanes and different types of modeling techniques that I could figure out how to answer those questions. And I became very intrigued and ultimately very passionate about it. And ultimately, that one thing led to another, and it ended up to be the first catastrophe model.
So at that point, when that company brings you in, how are they thinking about their coastal exposure up to that point? Are they, or are they just nervous about it?
Yeah, well, they were. I think it was very forward, actually, of that company to be thinking about it. Many companies weren't thinking about it, but they just had relatively, rudimentary tools. First of all, you mentioned this was the late 1980s. So
Right.
The tools available to underwriters and even actuaries were not what we have today, anything near. So it wasn't even computers were not that widely used. So it was more like what you could do on a calculator.
Right.
So basically it was just kind of adding up numbers and very subjectively kind of assigning PMLs. And
Right.
as I said, interestingly, the interesting story is the underwriters didn't mind that until they started coming up against caps that they couldn't write anymore. And then they started questioning these PMLs. And then why can't we write anymore? So it was really coming from the field, not understanding why there was a cap. And there wasn't really any objective science behind it. It was
Behind the
just
caps.
rules of thumb, the caps. So that's when they wanted a more scientific method to try to answer those questions.
So you come in and start creating the first cat model for this company. I'm assuming at this time, there's a whole bunch of competition where people aren't using anything. How do you deal in that type of situation?
Yeah, well, it's very difficult. And in that company, well, not to go into too much of detail,
Sure.
but that department was disbanded, not because of my model, but because they got into financial difficulties.
Sure.
And so I went to commercial lines actuarial. And again, there wasn't really a lot of understanding of why we really can't just use the tried and true actuarial methods, and why we needed a new approach. So basically, I ended up just setting off on my own and starting my own company, which was AIR in 1987. And as I said, I just developed a love of this whole idea of getting data from different disciplines, putting it into a model that could, spit out financial information.
So you had your first breakthrough with Hurricane Andrew. What about that storm was so different than others?
Well, it's very interesting, Adam. There was nothing really unique about the storm, but what had happened, I think as everyone tuning in realizes now, that hurricanes do not happen kind of uniformly across time. They tend to occur in clusters. So for example, 04 and 05, we had a lot of events, then it was very quiet, then it started picking up again. Well, what had happened in the 70s and 80s was a time of a lull in hurricane activity. We hadn't had any major storms hit any really populated areas. And what else was happening during that time period? People were moving in droves to coastal areas, particularly Florida. I don't know, like how many thousands of people they had moving there every day. So this vast accumulation of property value was building up along the coastlines.
Sure.
And that wasn't really being monitored. But with the hurricane model that I developed, the exposures were a key input. So the model was able to project based on the current property values what would be the losses. So the industry as a whole just didn't think that they could have a loss greater than, say, 7 billion. There was some report written by ARAC or something that said 7 billion. So that was what in everyone's mind. Hugo in 89 had caused only 4 billion. So they thought that they were really safe at, but the model was saying, you could have losses of 50, 60 billion. And it was really hard to believe. But then, of course, when Andrew happened, which, by the way, Andrew hit south of Miami near Homestead, the loss was 15 billion. Everybody could just calculate again on a calculator that had Andrew hit about 50 miles further north, the loss would have been about 50 or 60 billion. So pretty much that event, there was nothing, it was a Cat 5, it was an extreme event, but what was different is a Cat 5 had finally hit an area with high population and property values. One of my favorite sayings is that catastrophes are like real estate. What are the 3 most important things in real estate? Location, location, location.
Sure.
No.
So how underpriced was the business at that point? If people were only thinking that a max loss is 5 billion.
Yeah. It was a factor of 10. It was like a factor of 10. It was just not even in the realm of, reality.
So since then, how have you seen CAT models evolve?
Sure. Well, the fundamental structure of the models has really not changed. But what has changed is really, most importantly, computing power. So in the first models, well, the way the models work is what's really valuable is they give insurers probabilities of losses of different sizes. So how likely is a $15 billion loss, a $60 billion loss? So to estimate these probabilities, the models create a very large sample of potential future events and superimpose them on today's property values. And then we come up with the probabilities of losses. So if you can perform, so the early models, you could do 1,000 simulations on the computers that existed, and that will probably take you 2 days. And you could only run things at 5-digit zip code. But over time, obviously, with the enormous increases in computing power, we now can simulate millions of events, and we can do everything at the property location. And we can include more variables. So the models can become more realistic and also more granular. So we can give estimates down to the property location level that are credible.
Are there still differences between how companies use models? Are there differences between how insurers and reinsurers use models?
Absolutely. And, early on, it was all about the PML, the tail of the distribution, and how much reinsurance companies should buy. That's what rating agencies looked at. That's what regulators looked at. So rate making was also there, but it was really important for reinsurers. So of course, the catastrophe reinsurers were the first on board with the models, and they were, because they had to price the product. And again, they were underestimating their product by like a factor of 10. So they wanted a better way to price the product. So it was all about reinsurance, and that was all fine, but primary insurers have other needs. And Also in the evolution of the models, I should have said more recently, what KCC is introducing are more physically based models that are not based just on statistical extrapolations of historical data, but are based on the physics of the environment. Because we're, looking at not just hurricanes, but we're looking at severe convective storms, we're looking at winter storms. And what primary insurers can do, they can really leverage the models in many more ways than reinsurers. So for example, with our hurricane model, we provide what we call live event service. So 2 days before landfall, our scientists produce high resolution wind and storm surge footprints. These go to our clients and they can immediately start seeing not only what their losses are going to be, but where their claims are going to be, how big the claims are going to be. So they can start planning their claims adjusting and booking, up the claims adjusters they need, so they can get in early. And as many people know, if you get in to mitigate the loss earlier, you can kind of reduce the development of those losses. They also can use the models for going all the way down to individual account underwriting, and make sure that they are putting the right business on their books, monitoring exposure concentration. So, and to do these things, there's more of a drive for more accurate models versus just, the rough models that just give a portfolio view of extreme events like hurricanes and earthquakes. So primary insurers are also into, I should say that at KCC, we're trying to rename it because we don't just model catastrophes.
Sure.
Again, we model all weather. So our clients get a hail and a tornado wind footprint every day, so they know where their weather claims are going to be.
But reinsurers haven't been as effective utilizing models?
Well, reinsurers again, they kind of have one purpose, and they don't always these days embrace the most advanced technology because they kind of are. It's interestingly, Adam, I think 2022 looks a lot like 1992. Okay, I don't know if you're aware, but there's massive disruption in the reinsurance market. The worst it's been since Hurricane Andrew. And it's not because a $500 billion hurricane or a big earthquake, but it's been from winter storms, it's been from derechos, it's been from tornadoes. And so, reinsurers have not necessarily adopted at this point the most advanced technology because they were pretty much set in their ways of using the kind of older models.
Why?
So
why do you think that is?
Well, it's a little involved, but there's kind of an ecosystem with the reinsurers and the brokers. And the brokers have licensed like the same models for 30 years. And they kind of have this all set up a process where they run the results, they send it out to reinsurers, and that makes it very easy for the reinsurers to, basically get all the data prepared for them, from the broker. So it's kind of ease of use more than anything else. But primary insurers have not been stuck in that. And a lot of our clients, this is the first time they've really licensed a model in-house or really license it to really leverage it for, because primary insurers can get the reinsurance information from the brokers. They don't need to run the models for that. So it's kind of pointless. But with our models, you can do your claims adjusting, fraud detection, individual, weather-related claims. So our models provide a lot more applications for primary insurers than the other models.
But are you seeing with this disruption in the property market that the utilization of models and reinsurance is changing?
Well, I hope so. I mean, it should be because even the weather-related losses are now hitting the low layers of catastrophe programs. So again, I would say that why is there disruption? Because it's very simple. Reinsurers have not been pricing their product adequately, exactly how it was before Andrew. But you get a mindset that you've got it all figured out, what's going on. You don't need anything new. There's a lot of inertia. Not just in all business, all industries, there tends to be inertia. And we have a saying, everybody wants to innovate, but nobody wants to be first.
Right. And you feel like people have maybe been more on their front foot with the high severity
Yes,
instances, but the attritional has been a little bit of a blind spot.
exactly. That's exactly right. You hit it right on the head.
Wanted to talk a little bit about climate change, something that you've been very involved with in terms of research. What predictions do you have about climate change over the next few years?
Well, first of all, we don't make predictions. I have to say
Okay,
that.
fine.
We're not predicting what's going to happen next year or the year
But if
after.
you did,
But what we do is we take all the science. KCC scientists, we don't work in a vacuum. We gather all the scientific research and knowledge from around the world on climate change. And that usually comes on climate change in the periodic reports of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what we do is we make sure, again, that our models are incorporating the impacts of climate change so that when we develop those probability distributions of losses, they are reflective of the current climate. Okay, again, and not the climate we had 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And so what we can say, the latest report from IPCC has high confidence in 3 extreme events important to insurers: hurricanes, wildfires, and floods. And so what we do know is hurricanes are becoming more intense. Sounds counterintuitive, not really more frequent. I know it sounds odd, but more intense. So we're seeing more category 3, 4s, and 5s. The proportion of storms that are major is increasing. With floods, we're seeing it, and this is regional by floods, but we're seeing more frequency of severe floods. And wildfires, I will say, which is no surprise to anyone, I'm sure, is the most impacted by climate change. And it's really in wildfires that we're going to see the fastest increase in the frequency and the area burned in the future from climate change. And not just in California, there are many other states that are vulnerable to wildfire. So it's really those 3 perils where we see the biggest impacts. And wildfire over the next 5 or 10 years, we'll be seeing the biggest impacts on wildfire.
How much of that is encroaching population densities to areas versus just more extreme fires?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, because one of the things that the media and everyone gets wrong, okay, and about climate change is every event is a record loss. It's a record breaker. Okay, so we, it's now we have, Ian, Katrina, they were all, I'll go back to hurricane for a minute, then I'll come back to wildfire, which is very misleading because what grows faster than the impacts of climate change are property values. So people haven't stopped moving to the coastline. They haven't stopped moving into the wildfire urban interface. And what I like to say is that if we go back and look at historical events and run them with today's property values, we are nowhere near record breaking. So for example, for hurricanes in 1926, a category 4 hurricane made a direct hit on Miami. Now, of course, in 26, no one lived in Miami, but today that would be over $150 billion insured loss. So that would dwarf anything that we've seen today. And that's a storm that happened in 1926. So it's the same thing with wildfire and other perils. Every year, we had a rule of thumb, particularly in Florida because of the fast growth. Every decade, your loss potential doubles just because of increase in what we're building and the cost to rebuild those properties in harm's way on coastline. So even if we didn't have climate change at all, generally we'd be seeing about a doubling of the loss potential every decade.
Are there other things that you find annoying about the climate change debate?
Well, that's the most annoying one. It's really attributing one event to climate change, which, we can't really say one event was due to it. Although I will say we are now able to attribute the increase in severity in some of these to climate change. So the only thing that I think is really misleading now is calling the losses record breaking. Because, and the other interesting thing is that what we're seeing, this may be counterintuitive again, but climate change is having more impact on the moderate losses. So
Right.
we have higher probabilities of 20, 30, $40 billion losses, not the $150 billion losses, because we're having more severe events everywhere. You know, the PML, the 150, that's got to be a severe event hitting Miami, you know, Galveston, Houston, New
Sure.
York. There are only a few places where we could really have losses that extreme. But if we have more intense storm everywhere along the coast, or more frequent wildfires in many different areas, we're just increasing faster the potential for 20, 30, $40 billion losses. So we're going to be seeing them with any regularity. So, you know, even an Ian of 50, $60 billion is not really that extreme, you know, today.
Right. So you were involved in a Nobel Peace Prize, the first person on this program, I believe. I could say that about. Talk about how that happened.
Sure. Well, I mentioned the IPCC,
Sure.
which for people who don't know, it was started in 1988, a collaboration between the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization to try to collect and synthesize, keep government officials up to date on climate change. So that was the focus, and make sure they had all the up-to-date science. So how they accomplished that mission was through writing reports. And again, they put these reports out about every 5 to 6 years. And so, of course, they had to get volunteers to write the reports. So I actually volunteered the early years. I think the first report was 1990, to write the chapters on the financial impacts of climate change and extreme events. So I offered, you know, modeling results and write-ups for those chapters. So in 2007, the IPCC, along with Al Gore, won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so what they did is they made copies of the beautiful certificate personalized with, you know, my name on it.
Nice.
Which they sent, you know, I received in the mail. I'm sure, you know, hundreds of other experts also, you know, received that, but it was just an honor to now have on my wall, you know, a Nobel Peace Prize certificate. I call it a certificate because it's not the actual prize, but
Right.
a replica of the prize but personalized with my name on it. So
Very
it was
cool.
a real honor, and I think it was very special of the IPCC to do that, because again, the IPCC just collects information from experts around the world. So
Awesome. Hey, one of the questions we got in was, have you considered cyber modeling, or is that out of scope?
yeah, well, we've considered but rejected. And the reason is because it's a man-made peril, which is
Sure.
very challenging to model. So obviously earthquakes, hurricanes, they're very challenging to model, but you know, at least Mother Nature is not changing, you know, every 4 or 5 years, at least radically, like, you know, humans can change actions. So again, I said that the important component of a catastrophe model are the probabilities. So we need to know the frequencies. So for cyber, to develop a true cyber catastrophe model, we would need to know the probabilities of every type of cyber attack you could have, you know, with every type of industry. And we need the probabilities, and that's almost impossible to do credibly. You can have expert opinion, but you know, it's not that credible. What's a better approach, we think, for cyber is more scenario based. You know, if this happens, what would be the financial consequences? So it's more scenario based, not fully probabilistic. It's just very hard. Plus, there's still a lot of challenges in the natural hazard world. So we still have a lot of advancements that we're making with the science on winter storms, severe convective storms, hurricanes even. So we still have a lot to do. So we'll leave cyber for others.
I mean, it's interesting. There have been people who have come out with cyber models. Is it, you think it's just too tricky?
Well, no, I think it's worth trying. I mean, again, when I had developed AI, or we were the first to develop a terrorism model, which is kind of the same thing.
Right.
It's not the same thing, but it's man-made again. And I really applaud those individuals trying to develop cyber models. And I think it's a worthy exercise for certain companies who, maybe have special knowledge in that area, but the users in many cases probably don't give a lot of faith in the probabilities. But again, they could still find the scenarios useful, without necessarily using the probabilities or believing those.
Sure. Well, we've got time, hopefully, for one last question here. It's kind of a combo. I guess it's predictions for the future of modeling, and what are your plans for the next 5 years?
Yeah, well, modeling will continue to advance. The science will advance. Computers will get powerful. And I think the main new things we're seeing now is a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we're embracing those techniques at KCC, again, with trying to make the models more accurate. Our goal is always to make the models more accurate for our clients. I mean, that's kind of the end game. Yes, the science is very cool and we bring that in. But we're really doing that and staying on top of climate change, making sure we have to update our models a lot more frequently than we did in the past. Weather models get updated every year,
Right.
So we really have to, we're really focusing on, the weather perils, climate change, and making sure our models are up to date and accurate.
And how about for you?
So maybe a rest at some point.
Awesome.
But I love it. I mean, Adam, people say, oh, gosh, you work so hard on this. And I say, you know what? I haven't worked a day in my life. It's been so much fun. I love the industry. I love the modeling. And I appreciate it when people like you ask me to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, hey, Karen, I really appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us. And thanks everyone for tuning in. So Karen, yep, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.